the Career Center.
Okay, so the topic for today would be paving the path towards a bright future. So we want to let students know any tips, any skills, the mindset they need to progress in their career journey, to travel through their courses in the university, to take advantage of the resources we have here at the university. But first, we're going to start with some background information from you. The first question would be, could you tell us about yourself? What or who inspired you to pursue a psychology degree?
Well, as you said, my name is Manuel Saldívar. I actually grew up here in Brownsville. I graduated from Hanna High School in 1992, back in the Flintstones days. As it happened when I was growing up, I had relatives, because my dad has 8 brothers and sisters. Okay. So I grew up with a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins. Yeah. Some of them lived in the Austin area, and we would visit them every now and then when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And so I really fell in love with Austin, the way it existed at the time in the 80s and 90s. It's a very different place now. Yeah. But a big goal that I had from the time I was about in middle school was to go to UT. And I was able to do that. Got a scholarship to go to UT. This was in 1992 that I left the Valley to go to Austin. Mm-hmm. And I was away from the Valley for about 24 years between college, graduate school, pursuing my career. And then I came back in 2014, about the time that UTRGV was being formed. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. In terms of my my career, my academic background, I'd always been the kind of person that wasn't satisfied with easy answers. I'm sure I made a lot of my teachers in middle school and high school crazy because I didn't accept the what of things. I always wanted to know the why, especially in terms of why human beings do the stuff they do. Why do we behave the way we behave? And of course, psychology is just the study of human behavior. Many students, many people, even just going beyond college students, because of movies and TV shows, think about psychologists as counselors and therapists. And of course, there's a lot of psychologists that do that. They work in a clinical setting. But there are also a lot of people like me who are research psychologists, and we try and understand human behavior on a more fundamental level. Mm-hmm. So that was the interest that I had, and I'm really happy with that, with the career choice that I made, because it's allowed me to investigate a lot of interesting questions, maybe look at people or humanity in a different way. And also, I think at the end of the day, especially since of all the things I could have done as a research psychologist, I ended up focusing on teaching. I like to say that I don't just teach college students, I study college students. Mm-hmm. Because over time, I've become really interested in the kinds of issues that we're going to discuss today. Mm-hmm. Specifically, how do students begin as students and then progress into professionals? Mm-hmm. The psychology term is called professional identity formation. And all that means is, how does an accounting major become an accountant? Mm-hmm. How does a nursing major become a nurse? Mm-hmm. And the challenge a lot of students have is, and I also have to say sometimes families too, as everyone, students and their families try to navigate higher education, it's obvious that if you want to be a nurse, you have to take some nursing classes, learn nursing stuff, or a nursing degree, of course, right? If you want to be an accountant or an engineer or a computer scientist, you take classes to learn that stuff, and that's an important part of it. Mm-hmm. But there's also stuff that students need to do beyond the classroom in order to develop their career, not just their major. Mm-hmm. And that's something I'm very passionate about, so I'm happy to have a chance to talk about that with you all in the audience today.
Yeah, of course.
That's great to hear.
So how long has it been since you got your doctorate? Because I know you're a doctor.
So I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 1996. That was in history. Okay. And I studied history because that was my favorite subject in high school, and I was kind of cautious about exploring other things, which was a mistake that I think I made if I go back and talk to my younger self. But I really learned a lot from history, even though I'm not a historian. I won't pretend to have that level of knowledge. Mm-hmm. But of course, history is another way of studying human behavior, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a foundation for me. My original career before I became a psychologist was working in technology. I'd always had an interest in technology when I was younger. And although this has changed in recent years, there was a time, believe it or not, when someone who was just had a casual interest could actually work in technology jobs without having a degree in computer science or information systems. And Austin was a good place to do that. So I was one of the first generation of what we now call web designers. That was the first way I kind of paid my bills when I came out of college. As time went along, I ended up working on a lot of projects because it's Austin, it has a lot of universities, a lot of public school students there. I ended up working in projects related to learning, to education. And I could do the programming part. I could build a website teaching 8th graders about geography or teaching 12th graders about world history. Mm-hmm. But I started realizing that I was really almost more curious as to the stuff they were learning and how they learned it. And how does the fact you're sitting in front of a computer screen, at least part of the time, instead of across a room from a teacher, a human instructor, how does that change the way that you think and learn? Yeah. And that was the first question that led me to graduate school. So I did a master's degree in education. And then when I was getting close to finishing my master's, I had originally planned on just getting a master's degree and working maybe for a testing company, developing interactive software. But I found myself really falling in love with the research process of how do we, never mind what we're trying to help people learn, how do we know what they should learn? How do we determine what they actually have to know to be successful? And of course, although college students think of professors with doctorates as educators, and of course it's a big part of our job if we work at a university, our first sort of training as scholars is to do research. And the idea, as you may know, around universities is if you get people who know how to learn stuff on their own as scholars, as researchers, then that makes it not easy, but easier to have those same people teach because they know what it is to try and figure things out. Yeah. So my master's in education led me to explore the possibility of getting a PhD, which was something I'd never really thought about very much, but I had some friends and professors at the master's level who were very encouraging. Make a long story short, I ended up finding the perfect program for me, and for graduate school, as an aside, you really want to find a program that makes sense for your life, for your own interests. So I ended up at the University of Colorado, where I earned actually 2 doctorates, one in psychology, one in education. It took me 6 years to complete both of them, and almost killed me, but I was able to do it. This was in 2011, so it's not quite 12 years. And I like to say, kind of joking, kind of not, it was about my years as a PhD student in Colorado. It was the most fun I ever had, and I never want to do it again.
That's really impressive. Like, I didn't know that first. I knew that you were a doctor, right? But I didn't know that you had, a doctorate in education and then in psychology, right?
I don't get to be doctor though. I check.
Well, it's still very impressive for me. I don't know. I'm gonna graduate this May, and I'm gonna graduate with a bachelor's. And I consider master's for a while, but thinking like further than that, like I'm still very like on the master's, like if, right? I don't know, it takes a lot of dedication and certainly passion. Right, when you said that you started as a historian, it reminded of Julio. That
I used to be a history major, and I kind of relate with what you were talking about how humans, they repeat their same mistakes, they repeat the same actions throughout history, and from a psychologist view, you can study that, and I don't know, maybe that made you want to pursue a psychology degree. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson I've learned in psychology is that humans are more alike than they are different. And an example I like to give my students, because I always have students, and this is fine. I mean, I as long as everyone's respectful, I don't mind being challenged, certainly in the classroom, because it helps me keep on my toes. But I'll have a lot of students say stuff like, well, psychology is just common sense. I mean, how hard can it be? And it's funny, when I first started teaching college students, when I was working on my PhD, I had a chance to teach students at the University of Colorado. Most PhD programs, of course, want to prepare people to be professors. So besides the research, which is a big part of your life day to day, many programs also offer students, PhD students, a chance to teach. That way you're able to get to sort of learn that part. And I like to think I didn't mess up my students too much, but I'm certainly a much better educator now than I was, 15, 16 years ago. But I bring all this up because in the early days, I had to use kind of abstract examples to sort of demonstrate, well, psychology is not really that much common sense. But now, actually, because of social media, I can give an example that students will easily understand, which is, if you think psychology is just common sense, there's nothing to it, then tell me, I ask my students, tell me you've never been watching a movie on Netflix and it ends and Netflix says, other people that like this movie also like this movie. And then you click on it.
Yeah.
Or tell me you've never been on Amazon and you've bought a DVD, or I guess in your generation, Blu-ray. And Amazon will tell you, other people that bought this Blu-ray also bought this Blu-ray. Or Facebook will suggest a fan club to follow. Or Instagram will suggest some other celebrity, the 34th Kardashian for you to follow. What those systems do, they're called recommender systems. And I actually went to grad school with men and women who now work for Google and Microsoft and Facebook and do that kind of stuff and make a lot of money. They're taking a bunch of variables, a bunch of information about the users of those systems and making predictions. And these predictions, of course, never work 100% of the time, but they work enough that these companies are all making billions of dollars, right?
That's true.
And that's because, as humans, our behavior at the group level can be predicted with enough certainty that it's worth it for them to spend all this money in order to make money from advertising and so forth. But that's a good example of kind of one of the things I like about teaching is, I tell my students this all the time, as explicitly as I can, there's nothing wrong with not knowing stuff. If you're a student, you are here to study. That's the whole point. And everyone starts out from a place of less knowledge, not less intelligence. That's different.
Yeah.
But less knowledge and going to more knowledge. But a lot of times what is a struggle for us, and this goes to the issue of career development, as a matter of fact, is not just the need to learn new stuff, although that's very important. Again, you want to be a nurse, you have to learn nursing. You want to be an accountant, you have to learn accounting. But there's also understanding the stuff that we think we know, that we really misunderstand, or I use the made-up term, misknow. Sometimes we misknow things, and that can actually be more of a challenge to kind of get on the right side of than even learning new material.
So it seems to me like you really enjoy teaching, right? And I would like to ask you, because you're talking about the experiences with your students. Since when have you been teaching at the university, and how has that experience been like so far?
So I came here in 2014. As I said, I first started teaching college students as a PhD student in 2006. I'll never forget, University of Colorado, Psychology 4411, Adolescent Development. That was the first psychology class I ever taught. I'm not sure who was more scared when I walked in, me or the students. But I had a chance to teach 3 or 4 different psychology classes at the University of Colorado. When I finished my my PhD studies, my first job out of that was at a research lab there in Colorado, and I was there for a couple of years. So I was basically just doing pure psychology research. Then I got a job at Florida State University in Tallahassee, which is not that well known in Texas, but it's quite a large school. It's about A&M or UT size. And so there I had more general teacher responsibilities. So I taught students there. There I had psychology, education, and statistics. And those, with my background, that's kind of areas that I've worked in, so I was qualified to teach. But while I was there at Florida State, I really enjoyed the job. So that was my first kind of immersion as like a day-to-day life of a professor. Although it took me a while to think of myself in that way, because in my mind I'm still 23 and just some kid walking on the sidewalk in Austin. But when I was at Florida State, this was the early 2010s. This is about the time that UTRGV was first beginning to be formed by, as you know, joining UT Bronzeville, which had been here for a while, and Pan Am, and then adding the medical school. My parents still live in Bronzeville. They're both retired now, but I wanted to get closer to them. And at the time, my brother, who's a police officer, that's been his career. He was in Mercedes. Now he's actually in Austin. But I'm not married. I don't have any kids, so I was able to kind of move wherever I wanted to go. And I thought, I would love to be in a new university as it first kind of comes up, especially a place like I thought UTRGV would be. And my bet mostly has paid off, that big universities, the job of professor tends to be much more focused on research, which is not a bad thing. But I always, as you've noted, I really do enjoy the teaching part of it. And especially being able to work with students who look like me, which wasn't necessarily the case when I was at some other universities. But to give you a straight answer, Claudia, I was here in 2014, and my first department I was with was actually biomedical sciences, and was with them for about 3 years. And now I'm in University College, which is also not too well known among our UTRGV students, because officially it's the place where students who don't have a declared major go. But we also teach the UNIV courses, which are first year courses for students that are just coming to the university and are meant to help them acclimate or be able to prepare for being successful in college. So this is going to be a chance to be able to work with students from all different majors or who intend to go different career paths, right? That have very different experiences coming in. You know, some of them come from the bigger high schools in the larger cities and valleys. Some of them come from, you know, Santa Rosa High School has like 4 students or whatever it is. So that's been an interesting experience. But at the end of the day, I feel like I'm able to make a difference in a small way. Not because I'm so awesome, but because there are opportunities to know students and get to understand their lives, and that in turn helps me, I think, make my teaching better in terms of being focused on the stuff that really matters to students here at UTRG.
Well, that's great. So you've been working with students for a long time. What is something you've seen that has changed in students, like through generations? Because you've been teaching from
2006,
2006. So it's been about more than 15 years, 16 years. What has changed within students? Their motivations, their mindset, something you've noticed.
Passions.
I think the biggest difference I've seen has been the effect of social media, specifically. And it's actually a story I tell my students, and they look at me like I'm describing dinosaurs, but I get why that is. When I was, I can't believe I'm saying this in public. When I was growing up, so I'm officially that guy now. When I was growing up, before social media, you know, the communication channels that were open to us were basically just telephone.
Yes.
So among other things, you know, telephone has to kind of be real time, and obviously it's not face to face literally, but you are kind of connecting with someone directly. And a challenge that I think I do see it as a challenge. I make an effort not to see it as a bad thing, because every older generation thinks a lot of new generation stuff is bad, and I don't want to be that guy. But you know, social media between DMing and things like Snapchat, where you have some control, at least hypothetically, over how long your message or your communication exists. Students often have a discomfort communicating or interacting with people in face-to-face settings because it's not something that has been demanded of them. And especially in recent years, because of COVID, unfortunately, this has kind of reinforced a lot of this, a lot of these challenges. And I bring this up not because, when I was younger we didn't have to. I mean, that's less of an issue than the fact that, as I think we're already starting to see, if you follow the news, for example, big companies are now debating going back to in-person work. And I think after COVID, a lot of big companies are not going to want to get burned. So there'll always be a place for telecommuting or people working remotely to some degree. But there's also a lot of companies, with reason, that really still want to have at least some part of an employee's week be around other employees, whether it's meeting, team building, collaboration, other things. So my point to all this is, fortunately or unfortunately, I guess depending on how you think about it, your students even now will not have a choice in their career in being able to kind of pull back from face-to-face communication. And so what I tell students is, you know, I tell them this because I try to be transparent about my teaching, because I don't, you know, I've had teachers and even professors who were, you know, this is why we do things, because I'm telling you, and number one, I never want to think I have all the answers, because I don't. And number two, I don't think that approach is really productive with students or any humans really. But I tell students, you know, there are skills that you need to have, that you develop while you're in college beyond the stuff you learn in your accounting classes or your nursing classes. And a lot of these skills you may not think are important, or you may not value, but employers do. Graduate schools do, medical schools do, so that's an important piece of it. Or to put it another way, we all have to kind of serve multiple masters, right? there are expectations we're going to have if we want to enter certain professions about skills we have to have. But more importantly than that, I tell students, if you take advantage of the opportunities you have to develop these skills while you're in college, then you can help yourself not just be successful in your college classes, although that's part of it. I think things like time management and professionalism, communication, teamwork will certainly help you in college, but they'll also help you prepare for when you're leaving college.
The transition to adult life, I think that you mentioned that students, they should take advantage of communicating with one another, because then when they enter the adult life and they are in an office setting or in an office job where you have to communicate with other peers, they're going to be less socially developed in some way.
I think, that's a concern that I have. And it's not just me. I mean, I've seen a lot of, I read a lot of research. I read a lot of business publications, not because I'm tracking the stock market or whatever, but because I like to see what, big bosses talk about in terms of their challenges with their employees or challenges in recruiting new employees. And this is a common concern, is that a lot of younger generations, and by the way, just to be clear, as I said, every generation has perceptions it has to fight against. My generation, people that were born in the 70s, and you may have heard of this, we were the slacker generation, named after that movie Slacker from the early 90s, which you may not have heard of. But the slacker stereotype is someone who just works hard enough to feed themselves. They don't have any ambition. They don't want to be successful.
Just comfort.
Right, exactly. And so this is sort of like, Nirvana, Seattle grunge kind of, just sitting around, wearing flannel. And that's no more true than any other stereotype. But the point is, my generation, when we got to the workplace, the prior generation, my parents' generation, were the ones who had invented yuppies and invented kind of this Mad Men lifestyle of being very aggressive and everything's about success and money. And I do think actually my generation was a little less concerned with money so much and more with trying to have a balanced life.
Yes.
And in turn, I think the younger generation is more, at least from my perception, interested in kind of doing stuff that has meaning for you, that makes you feel like you're making a difference in the world, as opposed to just being about money, which I think is laudable. But in order to accomplish that, of course, you have to have these basic skills. And again, going back to one of my earlier points, this is never going to change. The way that humans interact with one another, we have to be able to deal with one another, whether it's in the classroom, in the workplace. There are certain, I want to use the term soft skills that we have to have, because that's how we respond best to each other. And developing these soft skills is not really optional, unfortunately, if you want to be successful. I mean, the number one point that I make to students in this context of kind of getting ready beyond just the classroom stuff is that from here on out, once you start college and the rest of your life, you're competing against other people. And that's, I think, the hard mindset shift. K-12 has become increasingly divorced from how college works, with all standardized testing and other things. And I want to get into that whole debate, but I've had many students agree, so I'm not just, this is my opinion, many students agree that, well, a lot of times a deadline in high school, a deadline wasn't really a deadline, and I would have like 4th, 5th, 6th chances to turn in stuff. And even setting aside whether that's good or bad, because I'm not smart enough to figure that one out. But it is different from the experience most of us have in the workplace. And so I try and push students, I don't want to turn it into the Wolf of Wall Street situation, but I try to make students understand that, you are going to be competing against other folks. And people in your same major at the same university or at another, nearby university, are going to be competing against you for jobs. And not everything in life is either or, but some things are either or. Sometimes you do either get the job or you don't. Yes. There's not a middle ground. And so I try to encourage students to have the big picture view, and the details, of course, are important, but you've got to get, I think, through the first big picture acceptance of, I'm in a competition. It doesn't mean I have to be a jerk. It doesn't mean I have to treat other people as less than me, but it's a competition. I don't look like it now, but I mean, I was an athlete in my younger days. I don't know if you have ever been athletes, but you can have a very fierce competition with other people in football or track or volleyball or whatever, and still, be civil.
Yes.
So that's kind of, so as I tell students, you can be civil, but that doesn't mean you're not competitors. And it doesn't mean that other people may not have an edge over you because of these skills that they pick up. and one final point to us, I don't want to take us off track, but to try and kind of make this as real to students as possible, I always tell them, a lot of students come to college and they or their families even, their worst case scenario is flunking out of college. Mm-hmm. And I understand why that's not desirable, of course. But I actually argue to students, I think there's a worse scenario than flunking out of college. And that is focusing so much on the basics, on the things that are important but not sufficient, like only going to class. If your experience is only you drive to campus, go to class, drive home. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I know some students have financial reasons and you have to help take care of grandma and grandpa or younger siblings. So this is very complicated, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. Yes. But I feel most for students who work really hard and do okay, but because they're spread so thin, they end up graduating, but their grades are just not good enough. Not bad, but just not good enough to make the cutoff for employers to interview them. Mm-hmm. Just not good enough to make the cutoff to be accepted into graduate school or medical school or law school. Mm-hmm. Just not good enough to attract kind of attention that students that do a little bit more and have a few more credentials and a few more experiences are able to get. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think a lot of students become frustrated because they feel like, well, I just finished my bachelor's degree and I'm working at T-Mobile. Mm-hmm. Perfectly honorable work, of course. Yes. But I think that's the